I just want to welcome Mr. Joseph Cowles.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us here tonight. So about 8 years ago, I started going through my own, difficulties seeing my son, and I had a hard time figuring out why it was happening and how the system could be so difficult and why it wouldn't help parents stay involved in their child's life and preserve the balance and equity in a family balance, as opposed to pitting the parents against each other in something like a cage fight. Custody, in my opinion, I had a really hard time with that word, and it felt super antiquated to me. And the word custody, it means imprisonment, and when a prisoner is taken into custody, they receive visitations from family members, and I just didn't feel like those were the types of terms we should be using with our children and our families. And in my particular situation, I was the non-custodial parent, went through a custody evaluation, which was a fight that I never wanted. But when you're at the peak of a disillusion in marriage or separation, it's hard for people to think straight. People tend to be in a fight or flight mentality. It's a crisis, but yet the court and the state expect you to either agree on matters, or if you can't agree on matters, then the court is going to decide who gets sole custody. So it's really a zero-sum game, and the child is placed in the middle as an award. And I just felt that was very counterproductive. What it does is it drives litigation. And so I started getting involved, trying to understand a little better the laws, and I wanted to turn this pile of lemons into lemonade, so to speak. I wanted to try to turn this into something positive. So I met with my constituent representatives. It was about 8 years ago. Started there. One of my constituent representatives is also the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And so I started meeting with him for coffee in Eugene, and that resulted in a work group that the senator had coordinated, that I was part of. And it was all people that work in the industry of family law, and myself. And so the cards were really stacked against me, but I kept pitching to them the thought of replacing the word custody, scrubbing all statutes of the word custody, and replacing it with decision-making responsibilities. That is the definition of custody. So essentially removing the word and replacing it with its definition. In the state of Oregon, those decisions are already defined in statutes. It's education, religion, healthcare, and residence. While residence is somewhat split up, there's typically a primary caregiver, secondary caregiver, when you're talking about a parenting arrangement. And there's also a sole custodial parent and a non-custodial parent. One parent is awarded the custody, the other parent is legally disenfranchised from their child when they've done nothing wrong. It's really due to a loaded argument, nothing more, in most situations, in most circumstances. So, as part of the first work group, and I got the work group coordinator, who's also counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee, to agree to draft a bill that would, in essence, replace the word custody with decision-making responsibilities. But then inevitably, that bill was too long, and in the 11th hour she called me up, well, not after me badgering her and wanting to know where the bill was. She finally replied and said, well, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is the bill was drafted. The bad news is it's not the bill we agreed upon. It was simply a bill to create a task force, essentially another work group. And that bill didn't get passed. So I felt myself really scrambling, trying to keep my fight alive. And so I went and visited the chairman again and said, hey, would you be willing to create another work group in lieu of this task force? But this time, let's try and have a more diverse group, and not have it only be professionals in this industry that have special interests. And I thought there should be more participants in more the human services side of parenting. I think they're the ones who really understand families and children much better than lawmakers. So the work group was established, and then inevitably there were no professionals from human services. Again, it was a lot of the same lawmakers and the same public representatives and the same resistance, the same barriers. And but I tried continuing the fight. I thought I was getting somewhere, and then Ayla had joined in on the fight also, and she was part of this work group. It was she, I, and others that work in the industry. And I was really pushing for scrubbing all the statutes of the word custody, replacing it with decision-making responsibilities, empowering the court the ability to allocate each of those decision-making responsibilities. If, let's say, father was an educator and mother was in healthcare, well, maybe it makes sense for mother to make the decisions regarding education, father healthcare. If they really can't decide on matters jointly, well, then let's allocate these responsibilities and preserve the involvement of both parents and have the ability to make the best decision on each of the decision-making responsibilities. So back to my example, so then father would be would be responsible for education, mother healthcare. If you're both the same religion, you could share that responsibility. So in essence, this would give the court the ability to tailor-fit a parenting arrangement on a case-by-case basis, starting with the presumption of 50-50 parenting time unless there's something proven to where the child might be in danger. And so I just felt like, well, I feel like the starting place is half time. I don't see why it should be any different. And if you really can't, if parents can't agree on matters, then the court's responsibility should be nothing more than allocating those decision-making responsibilities. And by doing so, and then the third thing, actually, there's one other thing, is giving a child a voice. In the state of Oregon, there's no age in the state of Oregon where a child has a voice, a legal voice. In the state of California, it's 14. So that was another thing that I was really pushing. In fact, my fight evolved to what I called the three-pronged approach. And it was a child having a voice, 50-50 parenting time, and allocating decision-making responsibilities. And by achieving those three initiatives, it would really remove the fight. It would remove the weapons. There would be no more, I want sole custody, I start there and the other person starts there, while the attorneys are friends. It's like a fraternity. And they're going back and forth and maybe having a drink afterward and giving the other a bottle of scotch if they win the case. And it means nothing to them except a lot of revenue. And so my fight had really been, when it was all said and done through these 8 years, has been special interest groups, lobbyists. These have been the biggest barriers of achieving my goals because, in these work groups, there was a lot of collaboration, but as it got closer to the end and they had to produce these bills, that all kind of went by the wayside, and then the work group would seem to divert. However, this legislative session, I didn't want to end up empty-handed like I did the last session, and so I decided to jump off my soapbox and focus on any of the bills that had to do with family law that might be compromise bills, so we could get something out of this last session. And there were 3 bills passed. One was if one parent asks for 50% of the time or equal parenting time, and the court or the judge does not rule for that parent to have 50% of the time, the judge will now have to give their written findings as to why. They can't just say, no, it's sole custody to this parent, 80% of parenting time, primary caregiver, slam down the gavel, end of story. Now, a parent will at least know why they've been jaded by the court, and maybe develop a roadmap as to, how does the court see me now, and what could I do to have the court see me differently, and to recognize that I'm a fit parent or I'm an equal parent. And by doing so, then you can revisit it through a modification in parenting time. So another bill that got passed ties into that. Now the state is going to have alternative dispute resolution, so you don't have to go to court for a parenting modification. Again, but there's a caveat. The caveat is that both parents have to voluntarily agree. And so it's the same predicament as custody, or as sole custody, joint custody. So anyway, nonetheless, it's there. And then the last bill that got passed was a bill that will now require the custodial parent to notify the non-custodial parent of any major decisions that are made and allow for comments for the non-custodial parent to comment on the decisions that are made. So nothing fundamental has really changed. So although I think the three-pronged approach, removing the weapons, is really the end goal and makes the most sense. We're trying to get there, and the reason I wrote my book, which is Broken Through, I actually had written 2 other books, Broken and Broken 2. I incorporated those books into this book in sections 1 and 2, and then section 3 is the new writing. But essentially, the reason I've written this is anyone who reads this can pick up right where I left off. We're not having to reinvent the wheel. We're not having to ask the same questions and start at the beginning again, because that's what's happened in the last 2 work groups. In fact, in the book, I called them Work Group 1.0 and Work Group 2.0 because it was really the exact same experience. And in fact, I had reminded the work group that Einstein's definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome. And that's really what we were experiencing. So I encourage anyone and everyone to get involved. The last words of my book are, "Be it enacted by the people." And the reason I wrote that is because at the beginning of every bill that was produced, those were the first words of those bills was, "Be it enacted by the people." However, the people weren't really the ones who were really pushing these bills. It was attorneys and lobbyists for special interest groups. So the only way we're going to get traction is by the masses, the citizens, the people, applying pressure to their constituent representatives, let them know that there are issues here and we really demand reform, and we deserve it, our families deserve it, our children deserve it. And by applying that pressure, these constituent representatives, they want to be reelected. And the way to really get to them is to know that this is a big issue. And that's really all I have this evening, and I'd love to take any questions. Crickets. All right, well, thank you for your time.
When you were talking about the 3 bills that were passed, you said alternative dispute, and I missed that last one.
Resolution.
What was the question?
Alternative dispute resolution, as opposed to going to court for a parenting modification, you can now go to alternative dispute resolution. But again, the caveat is that both parents agree to it. And that's really the issue with custody, is that if one parent doesn't agree to it, in the state of Oregon, the court has to rule sole custody. They're mandated to rule sole custody if both parents don't agree to it. So one parent can easily say, "No, I don't agree. I want sole custody." And just for that simple reason, the court will legally disenfranchise one of the 2 parents because of that fight. And it becomes a loaded argument. It's not about who is a qualified parent, who loves their child, who is going to make sure that their child is happy and loved and healthy. It's about a loaded argument. It's and to be on the other side, to be the non-custodial parent, it affects that parent, and you feel like you've lost something super substantial. You've lost your human right, and in my opinion, it even violates the Constitution. In that, I think it's the 4th. I'm sorry. I feel that it violates the Constitution, your civil liberties, in being a parent, that those are stripped without due process. I don't feel that a loaded argument is necessarily due process. But anyway, I could go on.
The bills that were able to pass,
I'm sorry, January 1st, yeah, calendar year. And so just to let you know, The way legislation works is there's a long session and a short session. The long session is where more of the civil matters are discussed, and that is every odd year. So this next year is going to be an even year session, and these types of bills, and then that will be more monetary bills or bills that are focused on funding, things of that nature. So the long session is where we really need to get involved, visit your state representatives. And again, if you do choose to read this book, you'll know exactly everything that has happened thus far as my efforts, and then you can hold your representatives accountable for the commitments they've made in the past that they haven't followed through on, because that has been the case.
Just a quick question. The last two sessions that you've tried to get these bills passed, and following that, or seeing the snail's pace at which this stuff progresses, are you aware, I'm not from Oregon, are you aware if there's an initiative process in Oregon that can be taken up by the people in order to get something on the ballot instead of going through the representatives?
No, that's a good question. I don't, and I have really been working with the Senate, and I would like to get more involved with the House at an earlier stage. I feel that would have been beneficial. But are you referring to something like a ballot that would?
It's a ballot initiative. You'd have to, in Colorado they had that, but the odds are stacked against you a bit in that. You had to get 5% of the signatures of the people that voted for the Secretary of State. It ended up being just over 100,000 signatures in order to get something onto the ballot. But in Colorado, we've been doing this for about 10 years, and there's zero progress. And at some point, it might be more advantageous to do an initiative. Again, I don't know if that's a possibility in Oregon. It would be under state constitution.
There is a possibility.
Is there? That might be an avenue.
And one thing I'll mention real quick before I hand it off to the next speaker is that the state of Illinois has set precedents as far as scrubbing the statutes of the word custody and replacing it with decision-making responsibilities, allocating each of those decision-making responsibilities, healthcare, let me start over here, education, religion, healthcare, and residence. They're allocating those decision-making responsibilities to either one or both parents. So precedence has been set in the state of Illinois. That actually happened while I was, pushing my fight. So that really, I thought, helped me gain momentum. And then they were going to draft the bill, but it never happened. So let's hold them accountable. Let's make some progress.
Thank you.